Hey everybody, how are y'all doing? I hope y'all are doing really well as we get through this week and we dive into some niche topics and some really interesting and important topics. Today is no different than that. Today we are going to talk about the connection between religion and health. So a really fascinating conversation today. And really my objectives for today through these readings and everything is for you to understand the role of religion and spirituality and how that in these things influence health behaviors, like we talked about in the previous session, how these things impact health behaviors and health outcomes in turn. So we're going to explore, and the readings explore mechanisms through which religious affiliation, things like that, can impact health. And we've been like looking at empirical findings and research on religion, spirituality, and health from the readings like Barkin and the Schlunt and the Koenig readings as well. So we're going to look through all of that. And there's some key takeaways here that are just put up on the first screen, just because I want you to understand these things, these big key takeaways from this session. Number one is that religion and spirituality significantly influence health behaviors, outcomes, and healthcare delivery. Number two, that understanding these influences requires considering behavioral, social, and psychological mechanisms. Number three, empirical research provides valuable insights, but must be critically evaluated for biases and cultural limitations. And then number four, that healthcare professionals should aim to balance respect for religious diversity with evidence-based medical practice. So that's really the big key takeaways from today's session. So again, just as a quick introduction as well. So I want to really introduce the role of religion as a social determinant of health, all like the ones we've talked about, because it influences not only our individual behaviors, but also broader health disparities as we'll get into. And so religion has really a dual nature here when we talk about the impacts of religion and spirituality on health. There's a personal force and the social force of it. So the personal force, really that concerns providing how religion and spirituality provide meaning and purpose to people's lives. And that can reduce stress and improve well-being. So there's some positive impacts there. And there's also a social force to understand. So structuring communities with shared norms and resources and collective action around health. These are the key impacts, both personal and social, that religion can have. So some key questions to be thinking about throughout this session. Things like, how do religious norms influence health promoting or health risk behaviors? What are public health implications of religiously motivated practice like fasting or vaccine resistance? So all these things and more are ways that this can be impactful on health outcomes. But let's talk about first, what do we mean by religion? What do we mean by spirituality? Because there is a difference here. There's a key difference when we talk about these things. So religion is organized systems of beliefs, of practices and rituals related to the sacred or the divine, what we deem as sacred or divine. Spirituality is individual experiences of meaning, of purpose, of connection, which may or may not involve organized religion. So religion and spirituality can be different. So you can be spiritually religious, say as a practicing Catholic or Christian or Muslim or Jewish individual. But you can also have different type of practice. Meditation can be considered a spiritual practice, but maybe not necessarily a religious one. So there's a little bit of difference there. And so why do medical sociologists study religion? Why do we study this? So religion shapes social norms, and religion provides moral frameworks and organizes communities, all of which have direct and indirect health implications. So for example, the prohibition of alcohol in certain religions really does reduce the risk of substance-related disorders. So again, an example of this social and personal impact of religion on health behaviors and health outcomes. So again, think about those differences between religion and spirituality. Religion has that organized systems of beliefs and rituals and practices, oftentimes tied into institutions, and really typically provides a moral framework and guidelines for how we should live. Think of things like Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, those sorts of things. Spirituality, though, is a more individualized experience. Think religion as a more organized system and institution. Think of spirituality as a more individual experience of connection to something greater, to focus on personal meaning and growth and inner peace. Spirituality may or may not, like I mentioned, be tied to formal religion. And there is that relevance to health here too, because both religion and spirituality provide coping mechanisms, for example, for stress and illness and grief. Maybe that's prayer or meditation or walking or whatever it might be, communal type of events. And religion's structured nature, how structured religion is, may offer communal support, while spirituality's flexibility allows for personalized approaches to well-being as well. So some key influence of understanding the differences and dynamics of religion and spirituality and how those things can impact health behaviors and outcomes. So let's talk about mechanisms of religious influence. So number one, starting with behavioral pathways. We're going to think of this in terms of positive and negative behavioral pathways. Positive being practices like regular prayer and meditation that help to reduce stress and improve mental health, whereas negative being opposition to certain medical treatments, like opposition to blood transfusions or vaccinations based upon one's religious beliefs. So there can be both negative and positive. And what we mean by that is not being judgmental of those practices and beliefs, but saying that these certain behaviors that influenced by religion can have positive impacts on our health behaviors and negative impacts on our health outcomes. So these both dichotomies there. Second there, social pathways. So faith communities often provide social support. Remember we talked about the importance of communal social support, social isolation, social networks. Religion can be a really powerful influence there. And so that can help to reduce isolation and stress while also promoting maybe healthier behavior. So for example, support groups organized by churches for maybe addiction recovery or chronic illness management can be really powerful impacts on community members and their health behaviors and outcomes. And then third, there, psychological pathways. So religious faith can enhance resilience, provide coping mechanisms during crises, and reduce anxiety about mortality, even as we all humans die, right? And so religion can be a place of helping people to cope with mortality, especially people dealing with a mortal illness or a terminal illness. And so, for example, like belief in an afterlife can reduce fear of death, particularly for those like terminally ill patients. A couple of the discussions on really three of the key readings here, the Barken, the Schlunt, and the Koenig reading. Just to give like high-level overviews, essentially. So of the Barken religion, thinking of religion as a social determinant of health, or the Barken reading, some key points from this reading include that religion influences health outcomes through aspects like social cohesion, shared norms, and structured support system, things like we mentioned already, and that religious institutions often do mediate access to healthcare in underserved communities. You think of things like social services, right? Like disability and mental health services. Many of this started in religious institutions. I actually worked for a pretty good sized nonprofit in Minnesota on disability and mental health services that actually originated from a church group. So this actually was a program that started as a support support through a church and then grew into this larger thing and kind of exited that and became a nonpartisan organization, or not a nonpartisan, but a religious organization. But it started as that religious support. So religious institutions and organizations in our communities have very profound impacts and absolutely can have those profound impacts, especially in the social services world. So think about things like, how does religion intersect with other social determinants like socioeconomic status or race? What are the limitations on relying on religious organizations for healthcare access? There can be limitations there. And on the Schlunt reading here, really the key points are that this is an empirical study linking religious affiliation and health behaviors among African-American populations, specifically in Nashville, I believe, in the reading. And so they found that regular church attendance was actually associated with healthier dietary practices and lower rates of smoking. So why do you think might church attendance promote healthier behaviors? Are there potential risks in over-relying on religion for health promotion? Think of things like the stigmatization of illness. So a really important link that the Schlunt reading goes into there. And think about that. Why might that be the case? That social cohesion, the social support of it all. And then the Koenig reading really explores how spirituality affects clinical outcomes, and emphasizing the role of prayer, forgiveness, and meaning making in health, and how those things actually might feel very personal or spiritual or emotional, do impact health outcomes. So it really, the reading advocates for integrating spiritual assessments into clinical care, because we are, as we're increasingly medicalized. I know we talked about the report, report from the 1910, the Flexner report, a few sessions ago, that really pushed the medical industry, medical education in the United States to strictly on quote unquote scientific basis, right? And that improved overall quality, but also had those issues of care and overall quality of medical education and consistency. But it had those negative impacts of having the negative impacts on reducing really predominantly Black medical institutions and doctors of these different backgrounds. And also, we can tend to discount things like religion and spirituality as having an impact on health, but we shouldn't necessarily do that. We should look at the intersections here about the personal, spiritual, and emotional side of things that do have a real impact on our health behaviors and outcomes. So again, a little bit further on the introduction of religion and health. So some key points here. Number one being that religion is a multi-dimensional factor as it relates to health. So there's personal beliefs, cultural values, and social behavior. Let's start with personal beliefs here. So individual faith systems influence our decisions, like our diets, our exercise choices, our healthcare choices. For example, like faith-based fasting or prayer as like a coping mechanism. These things can influence our health-related behaviors. Cultural values. So religious traditions shape our collective norms about health, about family caregiving, and even end-of-life care. So for example, some cultures view illness as more of a spiritual trial, which may impact help-seeking behavior. And then social behaviors as well. So faith-based communities oftentimes promote social support networks that reduce isolation and provide emotional aid and encourage health promoting behaviors like regular exercise and stopping behaviors like smoking, and alcohol use as well. So the social behaviors are also key. And that's, as medical sociologists, we look at that really strongly. There's also protective versus restrictive impacts. So let's think about what is the protective role, what is the restrictive role. So thinking about specifically the protective role first. Religion often fosters things like social cohesion, right? So it connects people through shared values and shared rituals, which, like we've talked about in previous sessions, how important that can be to alleviate stress and improve mental well-being. And so these faith practices, such as meditation or prayer, as well, are often associated with lower blood pressure and reduced anxiety. So there can be these practices through religion and faith and spirituality can help us in our mental health related outcomes as well. But there is also a restrictive role here, a restrictive impact of religion and health. So some religious doctrines may lead to rejecting modern medical treatments, like the refusal of blood transfusions by Jehovah's Witnesses, members of those communities. That can be a restrictive thing that can actually very much negatively impact health outcomes in people's lives. Beliefs that stigmatize things like mental illness or discourage preventative care can also result in negative health outcomes. So it's important to understand both the protective and the restrictive impacts of religion on health. And then 3, medical sociology's role. So our research focused here. Medical sociologists study how religion influences health outcomes on the individual and community levels. Again, thinking about that population health level. We examine as medical sociologists patterns of access to care, disparities in treatment, and the intersection of religion with other social determinants like race, class, gender, socioeconomic status, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, religious communities have been really instrumental in public health campaigns, such as vaccine drives, but also in resisting public health measures too. So there's been that dynamic as well, such as COVID-19 restrictions in some cases. Many churches and organizations and religious organizations really resisted these social isolation of COVID-19, right? And having to isolate yourself, maybe in one's home as the pandemic was trying. We were especially the early stages of the pandemic, telling people not to gather in public spaces. There was a bit of a resistance from many religious communities about that. So again, there's a really interesting positive and restrictive dynamics here. And so religion and health overview. So I just want to talk about 2 things on this slide. Is that why religion matters for health, and then religious influence on health behavior. Just kind of give an overall here. So why religion matters for health. Really want you to understand that religion is associated with different health behaviors and outcomes because it can provide meaning. Religion can provide purpose. It can provide coping mechanisms during illness or during times of stress. And so religious beliefs can shape our actual behaviors, how we cope with those things, can also shape people's individual health choices at very personal levels. And so religious influence on health behaviors here, religion might encourage behaviors that both protect health, like discouraging substance use, or actually discourage medical treatments like blood transfusions, right, in certain communities. So it's just understand just a bit of an overview there, kind of a recap and overview of to understand examples of what these profound influences can be. So why does religion actually matter for health? Let's dive a little bit deeper. So just as a quick introduction to religion as a social determinant of health. Remember, keep thinking about what is a social determinant of health. We've talked over and over about that, and religion is another one. So religion is considered a social determinant of health in medical sociology. And that means, what does that mean? What is a social determinant of health? It means that religion is a significant social factor that can shape both individual and population health level outcomes. So that's the key factor there, is that a social determinant of health is a significant social factor that can shape both individual and population level health outcomes. And religion is one of those key factors. So religious affiliation, religious practices, and community support can all influence not only our beliefs about health, but also our access to healthcare resources, education, coping mechanisms during illnesses, and engagement in health promoting or risk or high risk health risk behaviors. It's also this meaning and purpose component. So the concept here, we're talking about how religion really provides many individuals with a framework for understanding life events, particularly challenging ones, right? Like illness or loss. And this framework often involves beliefs about a higher purpose, an afterlife, or a moral order. And this has the health impact as well, because research suggests that having a sense of meaning or a sense of purpose, especially during these times of key stress or illness, is really directly associated with improved mental health and overall resilience. So, for example, religious beliefs can help individuals to find peace when facing chronic illnesses or even terminal conditions. And that can reduce anxiety and potentially even lead to better mental health and physical health outcomes. So, some really important components there of how meaning and purpose can impact health. And then coping mechanisms and stress reduction is also key here. So let's hit on that further. So the concept that we're talking about here is that religion offers structured practices. Think of things like prayer, meditation, various rituals. And also religion also offers social support, like from fellow congregation members or faith leaders as these trusted individuals in your lives. And all of these things, the structured practices and social support, can serve as vital coping mechanisms. And that has that health impact, because studies have also shown here that engaging in these religious practices like prayer or meditation can reduce stress levels, which can have really direct physical benefits as well, such as lowering blood pressure or decreasing the risk of stress-related illnesses. So religious communities often provide that really powerful social support networks, which can also buffer the negative effects of stress by offering practical help and emotional support. So some key areas here to understand of why does this matter? Why are we talking about religion today? Because it actually has really key impacts on health. So let's talk a little bit further too. Religious influence on health behaviors. So let's talk about encouragement and discouragement. So starting with number one, encouragement of health protective behavior. So we've kind of talked a little bit about this, but really we're talking about how many religious traditions promote health protective behaviors as part of their moral or ethical teachings, which can also lead to adhere from, potentially harmful behaviors. So for example, like think of substance abuse. Some religions explicitly discourage or forbid alcohol and tobacco and other substances. Think of religions like Islam or the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, for example. And avoidance of these substances obviously can help reduce the risk of associated health problems like liver disease and lung cancer and addiction-related illnesses. Sexual health as well. So some religious teachings promote specific views on sexual behavior, obviously. And this can influence practices related to sexual health. So whether that's the emphasis on monogamy or abstinence before marriage, and that can reduce exposure to sexually transmitted infections at an early age. However, we do know that over-reliance on expressions of monogamy or abstinence also has negative impacts too, right? Because a lack of education around these behaviors as well, because oftentimes when you're promoting abstinence, you're not fully educating folks on sexual health awareness, can also lead to negative health outcomes. And this obviously has a health impact because these teachings, like what we just talked about, right? Like think about the health protective behaviors. These teachings can lead to lower rates of certain health risks among followers who really strictly adhere to these behaviors, like lower alcohol use in some religious groups. That's really correlated with reduced incidence of alcohol related issues. So consider that. Consider how religious restrictions on substance use might actually create positive health outcomes, but also think about the potential drawbacks, right? Maybe a greater influence of stigma around substance use in these communities that prevents folks from seeking help because of social shame and things like that. So think about potentially positive as well as potentially negative impacts here. And there's also number two, you see there, the discouragement of certain medical treatments. So some religious groups hold beliefs that discourage or prohibit certain medical interventions, particularly when these treatments are seen as interfering with things like divine will or violating religious teachings. So for example, blood transfusion. Jehovah's Witnesses traditionally refuse blood transfusions based upon their interpretation of biblical texts. And this obviously can complicate medical care in cases requiring transfusions, especially with kids requiring transfusions. A lot of gray area there. Vaccinations as well. So some certain religious groups may express hesitancy towards vaccinations due to beliefs around natural health or concerns over specific ingredients and what goes into a vaccine. So such as vaccines derived from animal products or embryonic cells. Those things can cause a lot of trepidation and resistance among certain religious groups. And there's also alternative approaches as well. So some religious groups support alternative forms of healing, right? Alternative approaches to things like medicine and healing. Things like prayer, faith healing, or traditional remedies, which may align more closely with their beliefs. So this obviously, all these things have health impacts too, because while adherence to these beliefs may be meaningful and important for individuals of religious identities, it can sometimes result in health risks as well, especially if effective medical treatments are refused, like blood transfusions and certain vaccinations. So think about how healthcare providers might navigate. How do you navigate these situations that we've talked about, that community and population empathy, right? And how important trust and empathy is. How do you navigate that with really advocating for procedures that could potentially save or improve someone's life, but that these people from these religious backgrounds maybe want to adhere to? So think about strategies that providers or healthcare professionals, maybe like you someday, could use to balance that respect for religious beliefs to the ethical imperative to provide life-saving and life-improving care. So I just want to reinforce, just kind of wrap up this section here, to reinforce the idea that religion's influence on health is very multidimensional. It's very complex. So it encompasses personal beliefs, it encompasses community expectations and broader societal influences. And religion can really promote health and sometimes as well create barriers to certain medical treatments with which healthcare providers and sociologists, especially medical sociologists, must navigate through quite thoughtfully. So think about both the positives and the restrictions here of the influence of religion on health. Let's talk specifically maybe about some of the mechanisms of influence as well. So there's direct effects, social support, psychological effects, and behavioral regulations. Starting with direct effects. So some religious practices like dietary restrictions, fasting, or substance prohibiting certain substances directly impact physical health. Social support, this is where like religion often offers social networks that provide emotional and practical support, which can help to buffer stress and promote mental health. There's also the psychosocial effects. So spiritual beliefs can contribute to a sense of peace and purpose, particularly enhancing mental resilience in certain cases. And then behavioral regulations as well. So religious teachings may explicitly or even implicitly encourage healthy lifestyles, which both lead to better health outcomes over time, of course. Now, there's more details on the following slides here. So let's start with direct effects on physical health. So just again, to recap there as a concept overview here. Many religions have practices and restrictions that directly influence physical health. And these can include dietary laws, fasting practices, and prohibitions on certain substances, for example. And these guidelines not only fulfill religious obligations, but can have direct physiological effects as well. So, for example, dietary restrictions. So many religions have specific dietary laws, like kosher or halal in Judaism and Islam, vegetarianism in certain Hindu and Buddhist sects, for example. And these things, these dietary laws can impact followers' nutrition intake. And these dietary choices can promote health by encouraging mindful eating, avoidance of certain potentially harmful foods. So those are potentially some positive impacts on these dietary restrictions in religion. There's also fasting, right? So fasting is practiced in various religious traditions as well. Think of Ramadan in Islam, Lent in Christianity, fasting in Hinduism. So intermittent fasting has been shown actually to have potentially positive health benefits. So things like improved insulin sensitivity and reduced inflammation. Though it also fasting can pose challenges for people with certain health conditions as well, right? When you have to be very mindful of health intake. So again, think about the nuance or the gray area. It can have both positive and potentially restrictive or negative impacts on health and health behaviors. There's also substance use prohibition. So many religious teachings discourage or outright ban alcohol or tobacco or other substances. Think of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints prohibiting alcohol and caffeine and tobacco and things like that. So adherence to these sorts of restrictions can lead to lower rates of substance-related diseases such as liver cirrhosis and lung cancer. So consider the health benefits and potential challenges, right, of adhering to these religious practices. Think about how these practices might contribute positively to health, or in some cases, limit individuals' access to certain nutritions or treatments as well. So there's a lot of gray area here. And the second point that was on the earlier slide, social support networks. So remember, religion often provides built-in social support networks through congregation or faith-based organizations and community activities, and that these networks can serve as protective factors against stress and provide critical social resources that enhance mental and physical health. So the role of social support in health, some key examples here. Think about emotional support to start. So religious communities often provide emotional support through communal worship and prayer groups and other faith-based activities which can alleviate feelings of loneliness and isolation. And this support is especially valuable during life's challenges, such as illness or loss of a family or friend or economic hardship. The religious organizations and communities can play powerful roles there. It's also practical support too. So many religious organizations provide practical help to members in need. So things like assistance with meals, right? Transportation to medical appointments or financial aid around things. And this can reduce the impact of stressors on physical and mental health, as individuals may, have tangible resources to actually rely on. And there's also this buffering effect I want to mention. So here, research indicates that strong social support can buffer the effects of chronic stress, like we've talked about, right? And so this reduces the risk for stress-related illnesses like hypertension and depression and anxiety. So again, think about how religion can play a really impactful role there for people of religious communities. And so I invite you to consider how social support might differ in religious versus non-religious contexts of how do we influence, how do we as population health experts, how do we as folks focused on public health, how do we utilize these sorts of communal impacts? And as we consider that at least the data shows that younger generations and burgeoning generations are less and less religious. Well, how do we promote a greater sense of community impact? And that community support is really powerful with health-related outcomes. So consider all of those things as we talk through this further. The third one here, psychosocial effects. So this is going beyond social support. Religious beliefs often provide a sense of meaning and a sense of peace and purpose that can really bolster mental resilience. So this psychosocial effect here of that mental resilience can be a significant factor in health, as it really contributes to positive coping mechanisms and emotional stability for example. So there's some specific benefits, psychosocial benefits here that can be profound with religion. So maybe a sense of purpose. So many religions emphasize life's meaning and purpose, obviously. And this can help individuals endure hardships and find meaning in suffering and face illness with greater acceptance and control. And so this mindset has been linked to improved mental health and stronger immune response. And there's also a spiritual coping element as well, right? So a belief in a higher power or life beyond death, for example, can provide comfort during times of illness and loss. And people who engage in spiritual coping often actually experience lower levels of anxiety and depression during health crises. And then reduced fear of mortality. So for many, religious beliefs reduce the fear of death. And this fosters a sense of peace that can have a really calming physiological effects, such as reduced blood pressure and lower levels of stress hormones. So I encourage you to think of examples of where you could see how a sense of purpose might align with an individual's approach to managing illness or making health decisions. You can also think about all the sort of studies and some of the stuff we've read that show the health benefits of a positive mental outlook, right? And mental resilience, and how religion and spirituality can potentially be have an impact there. So, and then the final mechanism of influence is behavioral regulations and health outcomes. So here we're talking about how religious teachings often promote specific lifestyles and behaviors that can lead to improved health outcomes. So these regulations might include moral or even ethical guidelines that encourage self-care, compassion, and avoidance of risky behaviors. So think about some examples here. So thinking about encouragement of physical activity. So some religions actually encourage physical exercise or specific practices that improve physical fitness and mental well-being. So Tai Chi, right, Taoism, or yoga and Hinduism and Buddhism, for example. There's also mental health promotion of certain religions. So religious teachings can, in some cases, encourage reflection and mindfulness and gratitude and forgiveness, all of which can actually positively impact mental health. So meditation, for example, is practiced in many Buddhist and Hindu communities and has well-documented benefits for mental health, like reducing stress and improving emotional regulation. And that third piece there, bullet C, under examples of behavioral regulations, moral and ethical guidance. So many religions encourage behaviors that foster a healthy lifestyle, such as honesty or clarity and respect for others. And these values promote social connections, which in turn support mental health and overall well-being. And there are some long-term health benefits to look at here as well. So research shows that people who adhere to these lifestyle behaviors generally, not every single time, but generally have better physical and mental health outcomes. So for instance, regular participation in activities like prayer and meditation or community service can lead to improved cardiovascular health and enhanced immune functions. For even example, further example, the data, lots of data does show that, especially for young people who are connected or were connected to a religious community or an active social religious community, actually fared better and coped better with especially the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, where there was that sense of widespread social isolation and sheltering just kind of in place with yourself. That social connection can be very powerful. So think about how behavioral guidelines from religious teachings might align or even be in conflict with more secular health recommendations like we've talked about throughout the course. So consider how religiosity or religiously motivated health behaviors may be influenced by cultural and community expectations. So just to wrap up, because we've had four components of four pieces of the mechanisms of influence: direct effects, social support, psychosocial effects, and behavioral regulations. All four key mechanisms of influence that religion has on health outcomes. So just as a overview there, a wrap up here, I want to reinforce that these mechanisms of influences work synergistically to shape health outcomes. So for example, a religious person might benefit from a combination of these, a combination of social support, behavioral regulations, and a sense of purpose that all collectively promote resilience and better health. So I want to also emphasize that understanding these mechanisms that we've just talked through can help healthcare providers and policymakers and you all potentially to develop culturally responsive care strategies that respect religious beliefs while also promoting health. Again, thinking about those gray areas where there are the negative, restrictive elements of religious behavior as well. It has negative and restrictive elements on health behavior and poorer health outcomes. How do we work through that gray area? That's really important for healthcare providers and policymakers. So the Barkin reading, just to kind of give an overview again as a quick summary. So again, in chapter 5, Barkin highlights how religious affiliation and spirituality can serve as a protective factor for health by fostering social connections and promoting coping strategies during stress. And just Barkin really here categorizes religion as a social determinant of health as it is, similar to education and similar to socioeconomic status because of its widespread impact on lifestyle and social support and health behaviors. So think about those examples of health behaviors that might be influenced by religious beliefs. Can you think of ways that a religious community might impact someone's access to healthcare? Be thinking about each of those things. And then the Schlump reading as well. So the study looked at the Nashville Reach 2010 project, showing how religious affiliation does actually correlate with health behaviors like smoking and diet and physical activity. And the study found that religious communities often do at times support healthier behavior. So a couple of key findings just to highlight is that certain religious groups reported lower rates of smoking, higher engagement, and healthier behaviors, and that religious affiliation also provided a framework for health promoting behavior that goes beyond individual choices and really embedded health into a communal and moral context. So think about how social networks with religious groups provide accountability and support and healthy behaviors. Remember, we talked about that, right? The importance of social isolation, the importance of social support and social networks. Religion can play a powerful influence there. So in what ways might religious groups serve as a model for health promotion programs? All these questions that I've been posing them for a reason. Maybe use these thought points and these questions as part of your discussion prompt for the week. And really the final thing before one last slide, just again, a summary of the Koenig reading here. I just want to make sure that I highlighted these readings as we went a little bit in different direction today, but want to make sure that we emphasize the readings as well. So Koenig's article here examines the relationship between religion and spirituality on health. So really with a focus on the clinical implications of what Koenig focused on. So his reviews of research shows that religious involvement is associated with lower rates of depression and anxiety and even substance abuse. And so some key points to emphasize here is that the author here is discussing how spirituality can actually improve mental health outcomes by providing coping mechanisms, fostering a positive worldview, for example, and enhancing social support. Clinical settings can also benefit from acknowledging a patient's spiritual beliefs as part of a holistic approach to healthcare. Again, thinking about how can we be less rigid? How can we be more empathetic, understanding, and flexible in our medical practices to include communal and religious sort of spiritual approaches. So I want to emphasize that integrating religion and spirituality into healthcare can create more culturally sensitive and personalized care. Obviously, it's a spectrum because if you rely too much on that, get away from the science and the hard-nosed science of medical care, then you're going in the wrong direction too. But think about how we can find that good middle ground of having a more holistic approach to create more culturally sensitive and personalized care. Now, I also want to emphasize, we've talked a lot about these potential proactive and positive impacts of religion on health behaviors, but also think about potential negatives too, right? I want to make sure that that does not get lost. Think about people from the LGBTQ community, what maybe a religious experience can do to mental health in communities that maybe do not support these individuals, maybe people who are gay or bisexual or transgender or non-binary, feeling that there's not just a lack of support from certain religious communities, but an active hostility towards these individuals. That can create chronic stress, obviously social isolation. So it is not, I'm not trying to say that religion has only positive impacts on health. We have to understand both the protective and the restrictive elements. And we have to understand how all these things work together to be better healthcare providers and affect change at the population and public health levels. So just the key takeaways here from the session. So I want you to have these 3 key takeaways, all right? One, that religion and spirituality significantly impact health both positively through things like support and mental resilience and healthy lifestyle promotion, as well as restrictively. So things like medical refusals, or like I just mentioned, right? Potential hostility or isolation to folks in the LGBTQ plus community. Number two, that healthcare providers and sociologists have to recognize religion's role as a social determinant of health, given its potential to reduce stress, provide social support, and guide healthy and potentially non-healthy behaviors. And then finally, that policy and clinical implications include culturally competent care and incorporating religious beliefs into public initiatives when appropriate. Just as a final reflection for you all, how might understanding an individual patient's or community's religious background help healthcare providers and maybe policymakers like you all, potential providers yourselves and experts and policymakers in the future, how might that help folks like you offer better and more holistic care? I'll be curious to hear some of these reflections in your discussion post, but that is it for today's section. It's a really fascinating topic, again, and sometimes a touchy one, right? Because we have very personal and sometimes very powerful, sometimes very positive, sometimes very negative experiences around the impacts of religion on our lives. So it's important to understand the protective and the restrictive elements here, as we've talked about some in more detail than others, but to understand all of that together is really, really, really critical. So if you want to talk one-on-one about these important topics, always happy to meet, as we have been. But of course, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm really curious to hear your discussion prompts for this week. All right, everybody. I appreciate it. We will see you next time.